General Hospital spoilers reveal that there were moments in Port Charles when history bent, not with a bang, but with a choice. A decision made not in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in the raw, emotional chaos of the streets, the alleyways, the cracked corners of broken families. And now, one of those moments was unfolding quietly but unmistakably. Carried not by one of the town's long-established power players, but by a young man whose life had been forged in the margins of truth. Giovanni wasn't meant to lead any war. He wasn't born with a legacy tied to ambition, violence, or manipulation. He was born of silence, hidden parentage, discarded truths, and the weight of growing up in a world that never quite gave him a place. But all of that changed the moment he stepped forward, not for revenge, not for ego, but to protect the one person who saw him for who he was beneath all the mess. Emma. And in doing so, Gio triggered one of the most dangerous shifts Port Charles had seen in years. Because this wasn't just a bold move. This was a new adjustment, raw, violent, and uncontrollable, one that proved everything was now going too far, and there was no one left who could stop it. The confrontation with Sidwell wasn't born from strategy, it was born from necessity. The threats had been escalating for weeks, buried beneath coded messages, surveillance photos. Whispers passed between shadows. Sidwell wasn't subtle in his vendetta against Sonny, and he had made it painfully clear that the best way to wound the Corinthos Empire was to go after the innocent. And that meant the young. Gio had seen the images on Sidwell's desk. He had watched the grainy black and white stills of Emma walking home from school, of her laughing near the coffee shop, of her stopping briefly at the park bench where she always fed the birds, unaware that danger was tightening around her like a noose. And that was the moment everything inside Gio snapped. He could have told someone. He could have handed the evidence over to Sonny or Dante or Chase. But he didn't. Because the truth was, Gio didn't trust the system anymore. He didn't believe in waiting for permission. And more importantly, he knew that if something happened to Emma, if the only person who saw light in him was taken, then no one else would ever pull him back from the dark again. So he made the choice. He would go to Sidwell himself. He would stop this before it began. And in making that decision, Gio did more than put himself in danger, he altered the path of every person around him. Because while others were still calculating, posturing, preparing for the next move, Gio had already stepped into the fire. And with him, the fragile balance of everything holding Port Charles together began to collapse. Gio didn't tell anyone where he was going. He left behind a short message to Emma, just a note that said, "Trust me. Stay home today." He hoped it would be enough. He hoped it would delay whatever plans Sidwell had in motion. And then he disappeared, moving through the city not like a scared teenager, but like someone who had nothing left to lose. The abandoned warehouse by the docks had always been a known meeting ground for dangerous negotiations, and it was there that Gio arrived. Fists clenched, voice steady, eyes cold. Sidwell didn't expect him. He hadn't anticipated that the quiet kid with too many secrets would have the courage to walk into a death trap alone. But that was his first mistake, underestimating what love can make someone do. The standoff that followed was quiet at first. Words exchanged between two men from entirely different worlds. Gio didn't beg. He didn't threaten. He made one promise. If Sidwell touched Emma, he wouldn't make it out of Port Charles alive. That was the moment Sidwell laughed. A cold, dismissive sound. The kind of laugh that said, "You're just a child." But that was his second mistake. Because Gio wasn't a child anymore. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't a mistake hidden in shadows. He was a son. A protector, a storm brewing in silence, and Sidwell had just stepped into the center of it. What happened next will be debated by the people of Port Charles for weeks, whether Gio pulled the trigger, whether he fought his way out, whether backup arrived just in time, or whether Gio walked out of that building with Sidwell still breathing only because he wanted him to feel fear for once in his life. But what mattered more than the facts was the aftermath. Because that confrontation didn't just disrupt Sidwell's plans. It detonated them. The war that had been simmering between Sidwell and Sonny was now burning openly, and Gio had become its unlikely catalyst. He had crossed a line not even his father Dante had dared to cross. He had gone rogue for the sake of someone he loved. And in doing so, he didn't just protect Emma, he declared a new order. When Sonny found out what Gio had done, the silence in the room was deafening. No rage. No punishment. Just realization. He understood then that Gio wasn't a boy to be protected anymore. He was a man stepping into a war that Sonny himself had spent a lifetime trying to control. And now, that control was gone. Because Gio had proven something terrifying, he wasn't afraid of getting hurt. He was afraid of letting someone else get hurt in his place. And that made him dangerous in a way Sonny hadn't expected. Dante, too, was left shaken. The man who had once struggled to accept Gio as his son was now faced with the reality that his blood ran through a kid willing to stand against one of the most dangerous enemies they'd ever known. It scared him. And it humbled him. Because in Joe's eyes, he saw a reflection of the kind of man he had once been, before years of procedure and hesitation dulled his edge. And now, all he wanted was to protect Gio, to be there in a way he hadn't known how before. But the window was closing. Gio had already made his move, and there was no going back. For Emma, the truth hit differently. She didn't care about the strategy or the politics. She only cared that Gio had risked everything for her. And when she looked at him after it was over, there were tears in her eyes, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing she mattered to someone that much. She wrapped her arms around him, whispered, "You shouldn't have done that." And he whispered back, "I couldn't let him touch you." That moment said more than any confession ever could. It was love, raw and imperfect. And it was the beginning of something deeper than either of them had ever experienced. But even as the dust settled around them, the repercussions of Joe's choice spread like wildfire. Port Charles was no longer in a state of cautious unrest, it was in freefall. Sidwell had been humiliated. His target had fought back. And now, he would retaliate in ways no one could predict. Sonny was preparing for blood. Dante was preparing for war. Chase and the PCPD were scrambling to rebuild order in a city that no longer respected lines. And through it all, Gio stood at the center, not as a victim, not as a mistake, but as the spark that set it all ablaze. This was the new adjustment. This was the new reality. And it was only just beginning. There was no doubt anymore, Sidwell wasn't interested in negotiations, leverage, or even victory in the traditional sense. He had evolved past strategy into something far more dangerous, obsession. What he wanted now was simple, suffering. Not just public humiliation, not legal ruin, but deep, personal, irreversible pain. He didn't want to destroy Sonny's empire. He wanted to watch it bleed. Slowly and deliberately, and he wanted Sonny to feel every cut. And so Sidwell made a calculated decision, not to face Sonny head-on, but to unearth the one crack in his seemingly impenetrable armor. The link in the chain that would make everything collapse under its own emotional weight. It wasn't Michael. It wasn't Carly. It wasn't even Sasha. Despite how fragile she had become in the wake of Daisy's kidnapping. No, Sidwell was aiming lower, deeper, more precise. He had studied the Corinthos family like a hunter stalks prey. He had dissected their griefs, their flaws, their silences. And in doing so, he had identified what no one else had dared acknowledge. The weakest link wasn't the most vulnerable. It was the one no one thought to protect. That was his genius. That was his cruelty. While Sonny focused his wrath on finding Daisy and fortifying Sasha, while Michael escalated his surveillance. While Gio marched into fire to defend Emma, Sidwell had already turned his attention elsewhere. He wasn't looking for strength to challenge. He was looking for fracture. Something easily broken. Someone who had quietly endured, absorbed the weight of the family's dysfunction without ever being allowed to scream. And when he found them, he smiled. Because it would be subtle. It would be slow. And by the time Sonny realized what had happened, it would be too late. This wasn't just a tactical adjustment, this was psychological warfare, designed to paralyze the Corinthos machine from within. To force Sonny into helplessness. And it was working. The attack didn't begin with guns or kidnapping vans or fiery explosions. It began with whispers. With carefully planted rumors. With anonymous phone calls and strange deliveries. With surveillance photos left inside private places, an image taped to a mirror, another slid beneath a bedroom door. One by one, the pressure built. The target, whoever they were, began to unravel. But they couldn't say anything. Because what made Sidwell's strategy so lethal was that it created doubt. Doubt in the minds of the victim. But also in the minds of the family. Was it paranoia? Was it real? Was the Corinthos name really that cursed? And while they debated, the target suffered in silence. Meanwhile, Sonny could feel something was wrong. He had weathered storms before, Jason's betrayals, Morgan's death, Nina's deception, but this felt different. This felt like his world was shrinking. Like the walls were bending in places he couldn't see. His instincts screamed that something had shifted again, that another adjustment was happening, but he couldn't name it. Not yet. All he knew was that he was being boxed in emotionally, and the control he clung to so fiercely was starting to slip through his fingers. Sidwell wanted this. He wanted Sonny off balance. He wanted Sonny doubting himself. Because a man like Sonny, so rooted in strength and structure, could survive being attacked. But could he survive being uncertain? Could he survive knowing that someone in his house was falling apart, and he didn't see it until it was too late? The brilliance of Sidwell's cruelty was that it wasn't about brute force. It was about precision. And as the weeks passed, as tension mounted, as Sonny turned his gaze outward, searching for bombs in alleys and snipers on rooftops, the real damage was happening inside his walls, quietly, patiently, irrevocably. By the time he realized who Sidwell was targeting, it hit like a brick through glass. Because it wasn't just about hurting Sonny, it was about breaking him. About reminding him that even kings bleed when you strike at the child they forgot to guard. And then the message came. Delivered not through traditional means, but as a piece of chaos designed to detonate everything at once. A package, no return address. Inside it, a recording. Shaky footage. A voice, familiar. Terrified. A cry. Not a cry of physical pain, but of collapse. Emotional. Psychological. The voice of someone inside the Corinthos family, unraveling under the weight of torment. And Sonny knew, that's the sound of someone who's been broken. He didn't even have to finish the tape. He threw the device across the room, shattering it against the wall. But the damage was already done. Sidwell had made his move. And Sonny had failed to see it coming. That realization did something to him. It wasn't just anger. It wasn't just guilt. It was humiliation. The kind that doesn't pass. The kind that infects you. The kind that turns the protector into the destroyer. Because now Sonny no longer cared about negotiation, optics, or measured retaliation. Now, it was personal in a way that could not be contained. Sidwell had drawn blood. Not from the outside world. From within Sonny's family. And that, above all, was unforgivable. The fallout began immediately. Michael shut down entire sectors of security, blaming himself for not catching the shift in time. Carly demanded answers, but Sonny offered none. He was too quiet now. Too focused. Too cold. Sasha, still barely holding it together from the trauma with Daisy, started sleeping in Daisy's room just to feel some piece of safety. Gio stopped speaking altogether, his silence more damning than any outburst. Emma noticed the shift but didn't ask questions, she just held Joe's hand and tried not to cry. And the target? They were still alive. Still physically unharmed. But emotionally? They were hollowed out. The effect of Sidwell's psychological war wasn't in the bruises, it was in the erosion of identity, of trust, of safety. And that's what made this such a horrifying change. It worked. It proved that even without touching a weapon, Sidwell had found a way to do what no enemy ever had, make Sonny feel powerless. But the worst part was still to come. Because when Sonny snapped, when the internal shift broke the last piece of control, he didn't do it with violence. Not at first. He did it with silence. A kind of stillness that warned everyone in his orbit that something irreversible had begun. He walked into his office, closed the door, and made 3 calls. One to a man no one in Port Charles had spoken to in years. One to a supplier known only by an alias. And one to someone who operated in places where the law doesn't reach. Each call ended the same way: "We finished this. I don't care what it costs." Sidwell may have started this war as a game. But now, he had awakened something ancient, ruthless, and surgical. Sonny wasn't looking to win anymore. He was looking to erase. And when that final confrontation came, and it would, there would be no warning shot, no clean arrest, no public fallout. Just silence. And finality. Because Sidwell didn't just provoke a fight. He rewrote the rules of one man's pain. And that mistake would be the last he ever made. It was never supposed to come to this. Not like this. Not with blood in the air and panic stretching across Port Charles like a storm cloud ready to break. But that's exactly where it had gone. That's exactly what this war had become. And it all led to one impossible moment: Dante, breaking every rule he had ever sworn to uphold, pushing past every internal wall he had built over the years. Charging into the heart of Sidwell's trap not as a cop, not as a soldier, but as a father. Because Gio was in danger. And for Dante, that was the only truth that mattered. Sidwell had made his move. He had captured the one person Sonny hadn't been able to shield in time. He had snatched Gio like a ghost in the night, leaving behind silence and dread and a taunting message. "Let's see what your blood is worth." And Dante, who had spent a lifetime running from the shadows of his own bloodline, trying to live by law, not vengeance, felt something inside him fracture. All his doubts, all his guilt, all the walls he had put between himself and Gio, between himself and the boy he never raised, shattered in that one agonizing moment. Because now it was no longer about identity or regret. It was about life. Joe's life. And Dante would burn the world down before he let Sidwell take that from him. The intel came through fast, too fast. A last-minute trace from Michael's surveillance sweep, a blurred license plate seen near the industrial yards on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a certainty. It wasn't even a lead that anyone wanted Dante to act on. But he didn't wait. He couldn't. By the time Sonny's men mobilized, by the time Chase got the go-ahead from the department, Dante was already gone, gun holstered, badge left behind, eyes colder than they had ever been. Because this wasn't a mission sanctioned by the law. This was personal. Gio was being held in a decaying warehouse near the river, the kind of place Sidwell liked to use for message making. Concrete floors. Chains bolted into walls. Darkness. It was designed for psychological warfare, and Gio had already been in it too long. And when Dante kicked open that steel door and heard his son's voice, hoarse, muffled, barely a whisper, something inside him detonated. He didn't see criminals. He didn't see obstacles. He saw his child. Bound. Bruised. Kneeling in the middle of a game orchestrated by a man who wanted to make Sonny feel the cost of his legacy. The fight that followed wasn't clean. It wasn't cinematic. It was raw. Violent. Teeth on teeth, blood on blood rage. Sidwell's men were armed, trained, waiting. But they weren't ready for Dante, not like this. Not when the adrenaline hit. Not when he fought with the fury of a man reclaiming what he never had the chance to protect. There was no backup. No cameras. Just fists and grit and blind, desperate instinct. At one point, Dante took a hit to the side, sharp, deep, knife or glass, it didn't matter. He didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He could barely see, barely breathe, but he got to Gio. He pulled him free. Arm around his back, dragging him toward the exit as sirens finally echoed in the distance. But Sidwell wasn't done. He emerged from the shadows like a specter, gun in hand, calm as ever. He didn't need to fire. He just needed Dante to see his face. To understand this wasn't over. That the message had been sent. That even in failure, he had won something, fear. But Dante didn't blink. He raised his weapon, hands shaking not from pain, but from rage, and for one blinding second, he considered ending it. Right there. One bullet. No questions. No arrest. Just justice. But then he looked at Gio. And Gio, bleeding and barely conscious, shook his head. So Dante pulled back. He didn't shoot. He didn't speak. He let the sirens do the talking as Chase and the rest of the team swarmed in, disarmed Sidwell's guards, and took control. But the damage had already been done. Dante collapsed shortly after, blood loss, exhaustion, emotion. Gio crawled to his side, whispering the one word he hadn't dared speak until now, Dad. And in that instant, all the pain, all the distance, all the silence between them cracked open. Because Dante didn't just save Joe's life. He proved to him, in the only way that mattered, that their bond wasn't conditional. It wasn't fragile. It was real. Port Charles reeled in the aftermath. Sasha wept when she heard what had happened, clutching Daisy tighter, terrified of how easily the tides could shift. Michael stared at the footage in silence, his jaw clenched, wondering if there had ever been a time where any of them were truly safe. Sonny, for his part, said nothing at all. He stood in the Corinthos kitchen, unmoving, watching the security monitor flash Dante's name over and over as he lay in recovery at General Hospital. There was pride in his eyes. But there was also something colder. Something permanent. Because if Sidwell had hoped to send a message, that Sonny's family could be shaken, that love could be used as leverage, that old pain could be weaponized, he had succeeded. But what he failed to realize was that Sonny didn't fear pain. He understood it. And now, he was going to return it. With interest. And for Dante and Gio, nothing would ever be the same. They had faced death together. They had bled together. And now, as Gio sat beside his father's hospital bed, hand gripping his, he didn't see a man defined by duty or distance. He saw the one person who had finally shown up, not with words, but with action. And that meant everything. The war wasn't over. But something irreversible had happened. A son was saved. A father was reborn. And the fire was only just beginning to spread. Something had shifted, quietly at first. Like the soft creak of an old door opening, long forgotten and sealed shut by years of silence and regret. But now, that door was wide open, and what poured through it was something unexpected. Something vulnerable, something deeply human. The relationship between Gio and Dante was no longer stuck in that bitter space between resentment and distance. It was warming. Gradually. Authentically. Painfully. But undeniably. Since the rescue, since that night soaked in blood and desperation where Dante risked everything to bring Gio back from Sidwell's trap. Something unspoken had settled between them, trust. Not the kind built overnight, but the kind earned through scars and sleepless nights. Gio now looked at Dante not with suspicion. Not with that coldness born from abandonment, but with something deeper, recognition. He saw in him a father who chose him, who fought for him, who bled for him. And Dante, in turn, looked at Gio not as the unexpected son that threw his life off balance, but as the one person who had forced him to rediscover his own heart. Every word they spoke now carried less tension. Their silences no longer brimmed with accusation, but with cautious comfort. Coffee shared without conflict. Music played without defensiveness. The kind of ordinary moments they'd never had before, now taking root, quietly redefining everything they thought they knew about each other. But as this new bond deepened between father and son, another shift, more subtle, more precarious, began to ripple outward. Because nothing in Port Charles ever changes in isolation. Every healing carries its own cost. And this new closeness between Gio and Dante was no exception. For Brooke Lynn, it stirred something raw. Something she hadn't prepared for. Because while she had carried the secret of Joe's paternity for years, buried beneath pride, fear, and the need to survive, she had never truly imagined what it would look like for Dante and Gio to find each other without her. She had spent years telling herself she did what she had to do. That the distance was necessary. That secrets kept them all safe. But now, watching Gio and Dante build a life together, without needing her as the bridge between them, she couldn't help but feel a gnawing ache inside. A quiet voice asking, "Where do I fit now?" Brooke Lynn had always been fire and fight and bravado. But motherhood, real, flawed, messy motherhood, was new territory. And now, she wasn't sure how to step into it. Not when Gio had been raised apart from her. Not when Dante was now giving him something she couldn't, a clean slate. And for Chase, the complications cut even deeper. Because Brooke Lynn's unraveling wasn't just emotional, it was relational. And he felt it. In every distant look, every missed conversation. Every moment she chose to be elsewhere when he needed her near. Chase had stood by her. Through music scandals. Through Quartermain madness. Through lies and fights and everything in between. And now, as Brooke Lynn struggled with her place in Joe's world, Chase felt like the collateral damage of a story he didn't write. He didn't blame Gio. He didn't even blame Dante. But he felt it, the shift. The adjustment. The quiet reordering of emotional priority. And that stirred an insecurity in Chase that he hadn't let surface in years. Because what happens when the woman you love is trying to rediscover herself, through a son you didn't help raise and a man she once loved? The tension, unspoken, grew like a vine. In glances exchanged but not acknowledged. In sentences left unfinished. In nights spent apart, even when they were in the same room. Chase tried to stay patient. Tried to be the understanding partner. But every time Brooke Lynn slipped out to check on Gio, every time she hesitated to talk about how she really felt watching Dante play father, he felt himself tightening. Wondering. Questioning. And Brooke Lynn, for all her fire, didn't know how to reassure him. Because the truth was, she didn't know how she felt either. Meanwhile, Gio, sensing the ripples he had unintentionally caused, found himself walking a line he never expected to walk. He wanted a relationship with Dante. He needed it. But he also didn't want to be the reason Brooke Lynn and Chase began to unravel. And yet, every moment he spent with Dante seemed to pull Brooke Lynn further into emotional territory she wasn't ready to navigate. He didn't ask for this family. But now that he had it, he couldn't unfeel what it meant to belong, to be wanted. And the guilt of that, the cost of that, was something he carried quietly. Especially on nights when he caught Brooke Lynn staring too long at photos she never took, or when he heard Chase clear his throat just a little louder before excusing himself from the room. Port Charles had seen betrayals, scandals, and war. But what was happening now wasn't a headline. It was emotional erosion, small, invisible fractures deepening quietly. And that's what made it dangerous. Because love didn't explode in Port Charles. It unraveled. And this adjustment, this new emotional constellation where Gio and Dante stood at the center, was just beginning to test the strength of everyone caught in its orbit.